Love is said too easily and defined too vaguely. I loved his mind, his very thoughts. I loved his way with words and the sound of his voice. I loved how he was listening when it wasn't apparent. I loved when he would look me in the eyes, how his eyes could speak for him. I loved how he held me, how his own happiness would radiate, how he would let me hold him. I loved his qualities and elements. He incorporated art and science without flaw. He was the poet and the painter, the athlete and the arithmetician, the musician and the muse, the analyst and the visionary. I loved his laugh. It was contagious. I loved his kiss, whether gentle and gliding or bursting with passion. I loved his whisper, how assertive his breath could be. How we made love was breathtaking, breath creating. I loved how he walked and how he ran after a soccer ball. I even loved how he sat while he ate or while riding in the car. And whether he was lying down to sleep or in eagerness for me, I loved how he looked then too. I loved how he dressed, bold and uncoordinated. I loved his long face. When he appeared behind a drum set or a guitar, I loved the happiness and expression that would wash over him. I loved the songs he would noodle or write. I loved his enthusiasm for singing oldies in the car. How he brushed his teeth or shook a frying pan. Occasionally he would talk with his hands. Sometimes he would stand with his hands on his hips, or perhaps with his arms crossed, with his feet a bit wide and head tilted forward. I loved it all. I loved his chuckle and grin at ridiculous things. I loved the pleasure he took in debating. I loved the twinkle in his eyes. I loved his hunger for life, that he would be a musician or a professional athlete, maybe a screenwriter, perhaps a chef, or even a doctor. I loved everything about who he had been, who he was, and who he could be. I loved that he loved to tickle me, and I loved his hands, so much bigger than my own. I loved that he loved his family and his friends. I loved that he loved words, music, storytelling, dirt roads, cabins, and pine trees. It was the purest form of love. It wasn't a trade where barter and balance could fail. It wasn't a feeling where emotions could sway. It was the resolution that I would give of myself without regard to what I could receive. It was the firm decision to love all of him. It was as true love can be.